I, for one, believe that this society should be inclusive of everyone. And at the same time, there's the notion of justice through this. There's the notion of equity, there's the notion of inclusion, and there's the notion of diversity. So diversity in the sense of representation. When we hear about DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's typically around issues related to race or religion or gender expression, that sort of thing. It's rarely about disability.
Welcome to Business Ninjas, brought to you by WriteForMe, where you'll hear from business leaders who are out there growing their business and slaying it every day. Learn from the masters. Let's get started.
Hey, everybody, welcome back for another episode of Business Ninjas. I'm here today with Denis Boudreau. He's the founder of Inklusiv Communications. Denis, welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you, Kelsey. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, excited to have you. So, Denis, why don't you start and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, my name is Denis. I'm the founder of Inklusiv Communication. I am the Chief Inclusion Officer as well. Basically, what I do most days is I work with organizations that are doing their best to become as inclusive as possible to different audiences that are normally marginalized for a bunch of different reasons. Typically, we're talking people with disabilities, people that are getting older, people that are struggling with the use of technology. And I help these organizations communicate with them in a way that will be more inclusive and will not leave as many people behind. That's roughly, what I do most days. And when I'm not doing that, I'm building the business so that I can do more of the previous thing that I mentioned.
Interesting. So, when you're talking about being more inclusive, talk to me a little bit more, about what Inklusiv Communications works to do.
Right. Well, yeah, absolutely. So some of your listeners might be aware that there are laws out there to make sure that people with disabilities aren't being prejudiced against when it comes to how they can be involved in the workplace, how they can take advantage of services and products out there on the web. I'm mostly focused on digital, so web and native mobile is where I do most of the work. But there are laws out there that make sure that these folks can still fully participate in society, and that we're not leaving them behind by a massive use of technology that would not account for their particular needs or expectations. So one of those, all of those laws, whether it's the United States or Canada or elsewhere in the world, pretty much every developed country has a set of guidelines, rules, or policies around this. And it all goes back to a set of standards at the international level called the WCAG, so Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And pretty much every country has aligned to this as an ideal for inclusion. So what that means, for instance, on the web is someone who is blind using a computer obviously cannot see what's going on the screen, don't even have a need for screens to begin with or monitors to begin with. Not really a use of a mouse either, because pointing and clicking is kind of pointless, pun intended, if you can't see what's going on. So they rely on other types of technologies like screen readers, software that will read information out to them, refreshable braille displays if they can actually read braille, that will transform the content on the screen into little dots that they can read with their fingers. Or if you're thinking different than say blind folks, providing captions and transcripts on multimedia content for folks who are deaf, or thinking about different ways to organize your interface for someone who's neurodivergent, maybe ADHD or learning disabilities like dyslexia or autism, like autism spectrum, like all these different things. They all come with their own sets of challenges. And what I help organizations do is figure out how they can communicate while accounting for all these different situations so that they reach a broader group of people. And, at the same time, not get sued or have a complaint filed against them because they're going against these laws that exist.
Mm-hmm.
In a nutshell, that's what I do.
That's fantastic. And, the work that you're doing is so important and so impactful. And I just want to, make a note that I appreciate the work that you're doing. But, you mentioned, just the one example of, the closed captions, things like that to, be able to assist, people who may, need that additional support. And, in part of your talks, you talk about the JEDI framework and as being one of the ways that you're really able to further the work that you're doing. Talk to me a little bit about what that means.
Well, it's an acronym for Justice, Equity, Diversity, Inclusion. It's one of the many plays on words around the concept of DEI, so diversity, equity, and inclusion. You've got a couple of others that include the letter A for accessibility. Like it goes around all these different concepts, basically. And it's really this idea. I for one believe that this society should be inclusive of everyone, and at the same time, there's the notion of justice through this. There's the notion of equity, there's the notion of inclusion, and there's the notion of diversity. So diversity in the sense of representation. When we hear about DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's typically around issues related to race or religion or gender expression, that sort of thing. It's rarely about disability. So that's where people like me come in, like just to try and remember, like help people remember that beyond all these other really important aspects, disability is a significant one because in the United States and Canada, just to name those two countries, but in the United States, 27% of the population self-identifies as having at least one disability, and in Canada, it's 22%, according to data from as early as this year for the CDC in the United States, the Center for Disease and Prevention and Centers for Disease and Prevention Control, something like that. And then in Canada, with the Statistics Canada, the 22%, which dates from 2018, if I'm not mistaken. So, recent data in all cases. And surprisingly enough, research shows that about only 4% of organizations, businesses out there who have a DEI framework, some kind of a policy around inclusion internally, only 4% of them actually account or recognize disability as being one of the protected characteristics that they work for. So everyone's doing race, everyone's doing gender. I mean, that's a very popular thing right now, and for good reasons, obviously, but almost no one thinks about disability. And yet it's a huge, underserved, underrepresented population, both in the workplace and out there in the marketplace.
So, a lot of the work that you're doing is, I imagine, engaging people in conversation, challenging, what they're currently doing and helping them kind of grow their strategy. Have you pursued, writing any books or anything like that to continue kind of furthering that conversation?
I actually did. So I don't have a copy next to me, of course, but I published a book earlier this year in March called The Inclusive Speaker, which is really a book for communicators in general about how, like, building the business case around inclusion first and foremost, and then introducing a series of personas so that people can discover how different people with different types of disabilities experience what we deliver to them, whether it's a speech presentation from a stage, or through a Zoom meeting, in a business meeting, internally with clients, sales pitch, whatever, like any kind of communication where you share information with a group of people, how those who have disabilities will perceive this differently than typical people would, let's say, and what you can do to involve them into that conversation. So roughly that's what the book is about. There's over, I lost count, over 200 different tips in there that sort of speaks to these different disabilities. It's built around 8 different personas. So you sort of walk through the book with them and you see things through their lens. All of that being supported by research, because I did a lot of interviews with folks with disabilities to really get a sense of what they were experiencing and what their pet peeves were, that sort of thing. And then the entire thing leads into the last section of the book, which is a bit of a framework to become more inclusive as a speaker yourself, as a communicator yourself. So going through 5 different stages that bring you from being someone very instinctive about how you present to someone being very inclusive about how you present. So that's what the book is about in a nutshell.
And, you mentioned, doing interviews, engaging with people, having that conversation. So for businesses or, entrepreneurs, CEOs, are kind of our listener base that we tend to have, what advice would you give them, if they're just starting their journey towards being more, inclusive and diverse in the workplace?
I think the very first advice I would give them is to reach out to people who have disabilities in their own organizations. As I was saying, 27% of the population in the States, 22% in Canada, you obviously have people in your own organization that have disabilities. chances are most of them are not disclosing, because 80% of disabilities are in fact invisible. I mean, it's very easy for you to notice someone who's blind or someone who's deaf, someone in a wheelchair, for like those are very, very visual, so obvious. But everything else we don't really see, and most people are not going to disclose because they don't feel that this is a safe environment for them to do so. So starting to build a relationship internally around, or a conversation around, inclusion, diversity, equity, and try to create a an environment where people feel a bit more safe to disclose these things, so that you can learn from them. Because way before you hire someone like me to help you, you need to understand where you're at in terms of an organization, and there's no one in a better position than those who work with you for you already. So that's my number one advice. I mean, just try to get a lay of the land in your own space. And then just look at some very basic things that you can check on your website. For instance, you can try to use your website without your mouse, like just using your keyboard, using your tab key, your arrow keys, your return key, or your space bar. Can you navigate through pretty much every single element of your website? And if you can't, there's likely a lot of really significant issues for anyone who uses the web differently than the paradigm of the mouse itself. And I'm thinking someone who might have limitations, like mobility limitations, and it's harder to use the mouse. Maybe someone who can't see, someone who has arthritis, carpal tunnel syndrome, or any other types of assistive technology that we don't really think about, that are going to depend on the keyboard as a foundation. So just trying that out, see how that works on your own website is usually very eye opening. And yeah, talking to your people and trying to learn from them what works and what doesn't work. And then once you have an idea of that, someone like me will come in, and then we'll help you make sense of all the information and build a plan towards more inclusion.
That's fantastic. And, I think that, like you said, kind of engaging people in that conversation is the first step, because I think that, assuming that you may know what people in your organization want, need, are looking for can honestly be just as difficult as pretending that, there isn't an issue. Am I right in thinking that?
Yeah, you're very right in thinking that. I mean, most people, the most common mistake, I'd say, that I see in organizations is that people are just going to say, hey, we need to do this. And then they'll send out a survey, for instance, and say, hey, we're trying to do this thing here with inclusion. Let us know if you have a disability. And, nothing has ever been discussed about that before. And, people have been working there for years, and they've been very successful at masking that disability. And all of a sudden they're being asked to out themselves. So nobody does that, really. So the survey goes out, and very few people will answer it. And then people get the leaders will get the results back, and just conclude, oh, we don't really have anyone here, so we don't need to do anything about it. And then they'll just move on to the next thing that they have on their agenda, and thinking that they did the right thing, and that they did their due diligence. But how it's perceived is very different. I mean, those who have those disabilities, because just again, I was talking about 22% of Canadians and 27% of Americans, but other research shows that around 20% of the workforce and 20% of the population identifies on the spectrum of neurodiversity also. So again, I mean, you have those folks internally, and those are the folks who are typically very hard to notice as being disabled, because it doesn't necessarily show when, in their behaviors. These behaviors are typically, misconstrued as something else. I mean, someone is scattered, someone is, lazy, someone is this or that, and people are very quick to judge on those different things. So long story short is, the leaders are sending that survey, and then they don't get any significant feedback from it, so they move on to something else. But from the perspective of those who have those disabilities, that 20%, say, let's be conservative here, so it's 15 to 20% of your workforce that identifies as such, and have not dared to come forward with that up until that point. What they saw was a very awkward attempt at reaching out, and then there was no follow-up, nothing. So they conclude that they were completely right not to say anything, because now they can keep masking and not have the fear of being prejudiced against or have any kind of stigma. And it just reinforces the feeling that, this place is not really accommodating for me, and they don't really feel like they they're loyal to you because they don't feel like you have your back. They're their back. As opposed to, like I was saying, begin by starting that conversation where you give a lot of, of your time, a lot of energy, resources to creating this environment where people feel safe. And then at some point you ask that question, like, do you have a disability? Do you identify as such? And then you can learn from that. And very naturally, I mean, those in that group who are more naturally inclined to act as leaders will emerge and they'll start talking to you. And if you show that you are actually paying attention to what they're saying, and then you're acting on what the conversation brings, then you'll start building the credibility that you need in order to be able to build this. Until that point, it's just like it doesn't lead to anything significant. And what it does for the most part is just build a lot of sarcasm internally around your failed attempts at trying to be more inclusive. So it's really a matter of perspective.
Mm-hmm. And, a lot of people say that you have to see how much people care before they're able to, really open up. So knowing that it's not just like you said, it's not just going to be another survey, another like, all right, check that off the box. We're inclusive, we tried. So, like you said, kind of engaging people in that conversation. I think that's terrific. And as founder of Inklusiv Communications, talk to me a little bit about the growth that you've seen kind of from day one up until now.
So it's a long journey for me. I started the business in 1999. So it was just 24 years a couple of days ago, because I founded it in October of 1999. So I began this way before these accessibility standards were known. Not that they're known that much today, really, but I mean, they're a lot more known than they used to be. And before most countries had even laws or even, a perspective on these things. So the growth was very, very slow at the beginning. And I come from a web development, web design background. So I did a lot of web design and development over the years, and eventually started focusing more and more on this accessibility piece, this inclusion piece. So the growth was on a very long term, really. And the way that it happened for the most part was as businesses were receiving complaints from clients and the media was starting to cover different cases like these that were more popular than others, typically with very large American businesses, most of which were either in retail or education, banking, that sort of thing. It became something that people were hearing about more. And then in Canada, because I'm based in Montreal, I'm based in Canada. So in 2005, Ontario adopted a law called the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, the AODA. And then that law was, the entire purpose of that law was that the province would be completely accessible, inclusive as of 2025, 14 months from now. And while that seemed like a long time in the future, 20 years ago, we're getting there, and the province is nowhere near where it was hoping it would be. And other provinces have followed suit since then. Most provinces today have some kind of a disposition around inclusion from a legal standpoint. So does the United States. So through that, the company grew because more and more people are either hearing about these complaints for their competitors, and they don't want that for themselves, so they want to be proactive about it. And others are on the receiving end of a complaint or a lawsuit, and they need to figure out how to get out of that. So both are bringing opportunities to my business in terms of how they can be helped in that sense. And what I do for the most part is really training, coaching, consulting. Now, like for the last couple of years, it's been what I've been focused on. So it's really about education. It's really about helping them understand and strategize around where they are, where they want to be, where they need to be, because those are not necessarily the same thing, at least in their heads, and then trying to get them on that roadmap so that they can eventually, meet those goals.
And so, you're talking about the province specifically. So do you tend to see trends in industries and size companies and verticals that you work with Inklusiv Communications, or does it run the whole gamut?
A little bit of everything. I mean, at the end of the day, whether you're in banking or retail or you know, any other area really or vertical, you most likely have a website. You most likely communicate with your target market, your audience. So and the challenges are all pretty much the same. Like I said at the beginning, it all goes back to this set of standards at the international level. So regardless of your vertical, you still need to put images on your website that need to be read by people who are seen by people who are blind. You still need to create call to action on your website, buttons and other links and stuff that can be used without a mouse. So like all these things are very similar. So most of what we do, of course, I mean, when we're strategizing with them, their context matters more. But when we're being tactical about what needs to be done, then running an assessment on their website and trying to figure out where the low-hanging fruits are, where the bigger gaps are, this is pretty much always the same, regardless of what their vertical is.
Interesting. Well, this has been a terrific conversation. As we start to wrap up, is there anything that you want to leave our listeners with, whether it be about inclusive communication, about DEI, anything that you want to leave our listeners with?
Well, I mean, since you're offering, I would absolutely love for people to get a copy of my book. So again, The Inclusive Speaker, it's on Amazon, both as a Kindle or a printed version. So it's right there for everyone to pick. And in terms of, your own journey or relationship with inclusion, like I said, just reach out to folks, try to have a conversation internally, see what you find with that. And if you have 5 minutes of your time, just try using your website with your keyboard only, not your mouse, and see how good or bad of an experience that is. Because most organizations out there, they spend a ton of money on their quality assurance people to make sure that the site works great, and it does. I mean, most people are pretty happy with the website that they have, or at least they were at some point when it was redesigned, and everything is tested thoroughly. But when you move away from that mouse and you use the paradigm of the keyboard, which is still millions of people out there that rely on that, you realize that actually that is completely broken and it doesn't work at all. A lot of websites, I'm not going to say most websites, but a lot of them, you can't even pass their main menu because that menu doesn't open up. Like the different panels that open up, they don't even react to anything but a mouse over. So you just can't even get through the website, which is a pretty significant barrier. So yeah, I mean, just take a look at, from an accessibility standpoint, what does your site look like from a keyboard navigation angle? See what you find, and reach out if there's anything that you think you could be helped with.
And where can I reach out to learn more?
So the website is inklusiv.ca. That's inklusiv.ca. You can reach me at info@inklusiv.ca. And yeah, a couple of social media links related to that brand, and LinkedIn, Denis Boudreau on LinkedIn. So DenisBoudreau on LinkedIn.
Fantastic. Well, Denis, this is a terrific conversation. I appreciate all of your insights, engaging, not only companies, but also, our podcast listeners with DEI conversations, how to be more inclusive. I like the little tips and tricks that you gave. The keyboard navigation is a great way, a first step for people to take away from this episode. So I think this was a terrific conversation. I really appreciate you being on Business Ninjas today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah,
have a good day.
Great to have you.